Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to MDC 215. Today, we're going to deploy an entire RDS farm in less than 60 minutes, doing one thing we all like. Click, 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 done. My name is Monish Chaturvedi. I'm a PFE based in Melbourne.
And my name is Mark Jordan. I'm also a PFE based in Melbourne, specialising in identity and platforms.
So, PFE, or Premier Field Engineer. Our job at Microsoft involves working with customers to ensure you never have to involve Microsoft support reactively. And we do that by mitigating risks before they become issue. Typically, we do health checks, risk assessment programs, and deliver deep technical workshops. And if something really does go bad, we also go on site and help you get up back on your feet.
So we just wanted to take a quick moment to say a big special thanks. We're Premier Field Engineers, so we spend most of our time just dealing with customers like you every day. And it means a lot to us to come out here and speak to such an audience and talk about some of our experiences, some of our war stories and all that sort of stuff as well. Certainly as we progress through, you might have a number of questions, you might have some feedback for us and that sort of thing. So if you want to tweet hashtag MDC215 as we progress through the session, then that'd be great. We know there's a heap of other really, really great sessions going on at the moment. So yeah, as I said, we really, really thank you for coming out and supporting us and listening.
So the session objectives for today, number one, is to get a better understanding of remote desktop services. Number two, we want you to experience the RDS installation wizard, the one thing that's going to make all the demos rock. Number three, we want to talk about session versus remote app versus VDI and decide which is the best case to use what. And finally, we want to make sure that you believe you can get it done in under 60 minutes.
So I spent my life in IT as an operational engineer, as I'm sure many of you here are. I don't know about you guys, but I spent many, many late nights with calls like this. Does anyone want to sympathize with that? Has anyone else had that experience being an IT admin? Yeah, I want to work in this area of the room. This is where you want to get jobs. You don't seem to get any calls at all. But seriously, it was too often that I'd find myself, having a soccer game on a Saturday and just get that call like, that file server's just fallen over. We need you to come in and revive it. Or a 3 o'clock in the morning page. Does anyone remember pages? Bane of my existence. So as PFEs, we want to stop you getting these calls. So I've got a bit of a story for you, and I want to see if you can relate. Now, just imagine for a moment, and I know that's tricky because last night was pretty big for everyone, but bear with me. You're an IT admin at Fourth Coffee, one of the largest coffee distribution houses in the Southern Hemisphere. It's a bustling Friday morning. You're running around like a chook with your head cut off. Your staff, your co-workers, you're a little bit shaky on it. Can't seem to get the passwords right. I guess that happens in a coffee distribution place. So it's just cracked into mid-morning. The pages stopped beeping. Your phone's finally stopped ringing. Whew, time to chill out a little bit, right? Then the fire alarm goes off, just what you needed. Everyone's forced to evacuate out of the building. While you're on your way out, you hear that roads and essential services are to be cut. If you don't leave now, leaving everything behind, you may not get home. Certainly this is a story that I can sympathize with. Anyone here in January 2011? Me too. So, what are you going to do about it? You get home that night, you get a call from your boss. She says, look, Mark, it's been a rough day for everyone, but we need to get everyone working again. We've just had $1 million shipment land at our distribution center, and you need to get that in the hands of your suppliers by next week. This is Friday night. So, what have you got? The office is closed indefinitely. You can't get back. Who knows when? You've got no IT equipment. Everyone had to leave it behind when they evacuated. You've got a massive shipment of beans waiting for you at the dispatch center, and it needs to get out of your supply system Let's call it been and gone, just for all intents and purposes. So, your primary DC is unavailable, and so is your main office. You've got your DR site, but your employees have massively variable internet connections. And you need to find them a way to get into your site, to get into your distribution system. In such a competitive market, Fourth Coffee simply can't afford to miss this shipment. What are you going to do?
So let's go over some of the basic facts of the story. Number one, the staff at Fourth Coffee have been evacuated on an office on a Friday afternoon. Number two, the VPN endpoints are available. Your DR site is available, but the primary office and all the devices contained therein are inaccessible. And number three, countless bean orders or something related to IT is stuck because staff do not have access to that IT, right? So the ask from you at this point is to enable your staff access to those IT systems without physically being present. And that's where the story or the demo kicks in.
So what we really want to do is save your weekend. There's 10 times more things you could be doing, rather than sitting in a data center trying to muddle something together. Well, Manish, I know what we're going to be doing, right?
Well, absolutely yes. So what we want to do today is take you through a journey of getting this scenario worked out through the use of RDS Session Installation Wizard. Now, in order to do that, we are going to introduce the hero of our day. And that's this often ignored small radio button, which you see every single time you add a new feature in Server 2012. Has anybody seen this?
Whoa. You said I was the remote desktop services installation wizard. What's this? You said me.
No, you're not the wizard. This is the wizard.
Every time like this with you, Manish. I'm so sick of this. It was the Fair Share Fairy last week, now the wizard. What next?
If you're going to be such a baby about it, why don't you show them why you should be the wizard?
Wait, seriously?
Yes, you can.
Huh. Okay. So, I've spent months in my mum's basement drinking nothing but espresso shots, but I have the best script for you guys right now. So, what we're going to do is we're going to deploy a brand new IaaS VM in Azure. Thanks, mate. When it pops up. Sorry. We'll sort that out. Oh, there it is. We're going to script for you. It's going to deploy a brand new IaaS VM in Azure. And then what we're going to do is we're going to configure remote desktop services just by hitting play. So just to prove there's no rabbits up my hat, what we might do is we might just quickly, everyone familiar with Azure? I'll zoom in a second. So let's get an Azure VM. How good's IntelliSense and autocomplete in version 3? So good. And we'll check out what's, sorry, I'll just check out what's already in my implementation.
Sure. So what we're trying to do is, while we are going to show you the RDS installation wizard, this PowerShell script, which will pretty much match up every single step of the way, and we're going to make this PowerShell script available for you after the session as part of the PowerPoint deck that you can download from Channel 9. And eventually, you will be able to access all the resources deployed in Azure based on this script. So this is just for kicks, something that we just thought of putting it together.
So we've just got one DC in Azure at the moment, but we could just have a VPN connection or something like that, some way to get us back to the main office. So we'll come back to this shortly, but for now, I'm just going to hit play on my script.
So before we move forward with the demo, we just want to get some of the RDS jargon out of the way. We will be using these terms synonymously during the session, so it's only fair we give it a little bit of time and explain what these terms really mean. The RDS connection broker is the first role. The connection broker is akin to a load balancer, and the key job of this connection broker is to broker the incoming connections from RDP client to the appropriate session host server, either serving remote apps or session-based desktops. Now, if I do not want to expose 3389 on internet, I can leverage RD Gateway Server to give me the functionality of RDP over HTTPS. The RD Web Access is an IIS server sort of like a web portal, which delivers all of these remote resources to the end users. And we will show a demo of how that works as well. And finally, something which is new to Server 2012 and 2012 R2 is this session collection. This is similar to what we used to consider a terminal server or an RDS farm earlier. It is responsible to define what the user settings, connection settings should be for a group of RD session host servers serving either the session desktops or the VDI-based collections. Now, with that comes a clear connection between what a remote app versus a session-based desktop is. Now, how many of you here have heard of the term remote app or seen that in action? Show of hands. Very good. So remote app traditionally was designed to hide the complexities of a user's desktop from within the user's interface when they log on a remote application. So it sort of takes a traditional desktop experience, which is something like this, and transforms it into just the application UI. With that in picture, let's talk about what we will showcase in our demo today. Mark?
Yeah. So why do we choose remote desktop sessions to talk about? Particularly in Server 2012, we've got a number of really, really great new features, and these are expanded in Server 2012 R2. We'll talk about efficient management, and Manish is about to show you. It is so easy to deploy remote desktop services in Server 2012. How many, show of hands, 2008 R2, who deployed RDS? Did you enjoy the 106-page quick start guide? That was awesome. We've changed it. 6, next. Cool, huh? We've also got unified administration. So from the Server Manager console, you can see your entire RDS deployment. You can see your gateways, you can see your session hosts, and you can see your connection brokers, all from the one unified console. You don't need to log on to any number of terminal servers or session hosts or anything like that. It's all right there for you. We've added a number of usability enhancements. These include user profile disks, things like fair share, as well as flexible storage options. So fair share allows us to target those users that are potentially using, too many resources. Pull them back, give everyone a nice, consistent experience across the board, and ensure that we're not hammering these terminal servers. Finally, a rich user experience. We've made massive enhancements in remote FX, graphics processing units, and USB redirection, meaning that if a user's sitting at home, in Fourth Coffee's example, and needs to quickly print that dispatch order, they can plug in their USB printer, connect into the data center, print as if they're running on a local system. Not to mention hardware and software GPUs in Server 2012 R2.
So the goal for today's demonstration would be to deploy an environment which is similar to this. We're going to deploy 4 session host servers and create 2 session collections out of them. One session collection will use 2 session host servers and deploy remote apps. In our case, that would be Bean and Gone. The other 2 session host servers will provide a complete desktop experience for the end users. We will then provide a connection broker to ensure there is load balancing and session reconnect capabilities for the session host behind them. We will have a gateway server to provide access to internet and a web access server to deploy a web feed for users to access that content from. All of these resources can be used on any Windows device as an endpoint, and we're going to showcase some of that today.
Why don't you show me what you got, Manish?
All right. So this is a Windows Server 2012 client or a desktop that you might want to use. What I'm going to do is I'm going to sit on this and use the Server Manager from within this interface and deploy all of these resources remotely. Now, the server that I'm currently sitting on has absolutely nothing on, and it's just a plain, simple operating system deployment. However, what I've done ahead of time is I've added all the servers that I want to pick up for the deployment as part of the Server Manager. So you can see all the servers are listed up here. Now, to actually kickstart our demo, we will go ahead and use Add Roles and Features Wizard, and which brings us to the starting point. I'm going to go ahead and bring us to the first page where the hero of the day is going to come in, and that's, of course, this Remote Desktop Services Installation Wizard. How many of you have actually tried this before? How many of you found this was often ignored and never really utilized? Cool. All right, so I'm going to go ahead on the next page, which gives me first of the two options that I care about. The first option of a standard deployment allows me to take all of these different RD roles and deploy it on a single server so that I can test out whether my configuration actually works. Now, in today's case, I'm going to actually do a standard deployment so I can distribute different roles on different servers. The quick start would basically be used in a test case environment. So let's go ahead and click on Next. The deployment scenario allows us to select whether we are going to provide these remote resources through a VDI-based scenario or an old-school terminal server-based scenario, which is now known as remote desktop services. So in this case, I'm going to select session-based desktop deployment. Once I kickstart the deployment, I'm going to have Mark come in and actually distinguish between what these different options are. So we will come back and describe the difference between these two. Next up, I get a start page where I'm told that to create and follow through this wizard, I need to identify servers that are going to host one of these three roles. So there is a RDS desktop connection broker, there is a desktop web access, and finally, there is a session host that's going to actually provide that functionality. In this page, I have a list of all the servers that I've added to my server manager. All I'm really doing is selecting my connection broker and marking that as a server that I want to deploy that role on. Moving to the next slide, I'm going to see the option to select the web access server role and what that is required. And finally, I will have an option of selecting the session host servers that I want to add as part of this deployment. So in this case, I'm just going to sort it by name and select them. On the next page, I'm going to get a confirmation that's going to tell me what roles and functionalities will be deployed. And if you notice, the next button here is currently grayed out. This server manager is intelligent enough to understand which of these roles will actually require the destination server to go through a reboot cycle. Now, in this case, the yellow exclamation mark that you see is for roles that will require a reboot. So unless I click that checkbox at the bottom which says restart the destination server automatically if needed, I will not be able to proceed forward. So I'm going to go ahead, click here, and hit on deploy. Now, this entire deployment is being run out of this laptop, so it might take about 5 to 6 minutes for us to go through this. But during that time, I'm going to utilize Mark's help to describe what are the differences between a session-based and a VDI deployment. After that, we're going to come back, make sure this is complete, and then show you how to configure the final stages of the deployment.
Cool. So, session virtualization. Everyone remembers 2003 terminal services? A lot's changed since then, but the principle is the same. We conduct a single server OS installation that users connect into to get remote desktop connections or to get remote application connections. So you can publish remote apps, or you can just publish a whole desktop. We also have pooled virtual desktops. This is a bit of a newer technology, one that we like to talk about a bit. And the closest that I can compare this to in the real world is a hotel room, as silly as that sounds. When I check into a hotel room, I can do whatever I want. Push the beds together, doesn't matter. The moment I check out, cleaners come through, they reset up the room, everything's back to normal, allowing the next person to come in, get the same experience that I did. So pooled virtual desktops are very, very similar to that. We can just have a pool, VDI and stuff, people connect into it, they do what they need to do, role-based workers, they log off, and then another user can connect into that system. Does that make sense? We also have personal virtual desktops. Now, personal virtual desktops are most akin to user workstations. The only difference is we're deploying their workstations on server-grade hardware, sitting in a data center, potentially in the cloud. Now, the difference between our pooled virtual desktops and our personal virtual desktops comes down to the persistence. With pooled virtual desktops, however, we've introduced the idea of a user profile disk, which is fairly similar to a roaming profile, where we have one VHD that's assigned to a user that can roam with that user between the virtual desktops that they connect to, allowing them to have a stock standard configuration of regardless which pooled virtual desktop they hit.
So today's session exclusively focuses on session virtualization. And the reason we picked this is because it provides the least cost of implementation. And when we are in a pickle, this is probably the fastest way to deploy those services for the end users. Now, at this point, I'm going to flip back to my deployment and show you how far along we've gone in that. So as you can see, my deployment has indeed progressed quite a bit. I'm waiting on that one server to go through the restart cycle. And as soon as that is done, the entire deployment will configure itself. Now, while we're waiting on this, I'm also going to talk about something which we used to do back in Windows Server 2008 and 2008 R2 RDS deployment. If anybody has deployed a farm at that time, you would remember that post-installation of the RD session host role, you would have to go to each individual server, go to the local security group for session broker computers and add the membership. What it essentially meant was the configuration that we did was done on a per server level. The good thing about RD Session Host Installation Wizard is that it takes care of all that backend configuration on its own. So once it progresses and completes the installation for the session host servers, you're going to see the two progress bars for connection broker and the web access progress afterwards so that they can go and connect to those session host servers, add the required group membership, so all of this works as a package together. So bear with me for 1 second while this completes, and I should be able to move start.
Let's go back to the PowerShell if you want, Manish.
Yep. Let's check up on PowerShell, how far that's along.
So similar to Manish, we're still doing some deployment here, but you can see we've actually started to deploy these virtual machines. We can see that we have deployed the role service for RDS 01. The role service is complete, and we're just installing the RD Web Access now roles across that system. So if I flick back to my Azure portal, I can see that I've got a brand new RDS 01 system just sitting there waiting for us to use and waiting for the configuration to complete. So let's jump back to here. So if we take a quick look through what we're actually doing with this PowerShell, we can see that we've imported our publishing setting files. Let me grab the better one than that. We can see that we're importing our publishing setting files and connecting to the subscription. So we've got a specific service that's been assigned for this deployment. We can see that we're using a stock standard Windows 2012 R2 preview image that's available on Azure now. And we're also giving the VM a name. As we go through, we're passing through passwords as secure strings. And then we run a configuration script to determine how we're going to configure our Azure VM. So you can see that we've enabled WinRM HTTP. Now, Manish, I think yours is pretty far through if I...
Yes. All right. So back on my RDS installation wizard, the deployment on that wizard is now complete. So I'm going to go ahead and click on Close. And once I'm there, I can go back to my dashboard and actually see the new entry there for remote desktop services. Now, please remember, this client does not have any roles of remote desktop services deployed. All that it's doing is using a server manager, and it requires none of the RDS components for it to manage and deploy them. Coming back to my remote desktop services deployment, on the first page itself, and I'll zoom this in just a little bit, on the first page itself, I get a quick deployment overview to tell me in my deployment what roles and services have actually been deployed. Now, as you remember, we deployed a web access server, a connection broker, and 4 session host servers during our wizard. What we did not do at that stage was deploy a gateway server. So let's go ahead and do that. Clicking on this gateway, I get presented with a similar wizard window. And all I'm really doing is adding the gateway server and going and saying, go ahead and deploy this. It will not take a whole lot of time to do this. And as soon as this is done, I should be able to look at the deployment properties of the gateway server as well. Now, if you've dealt with gateway servers and web access servers in past, you would know there is a requirement to have certificates to do so. The same page where we are, the deployment overview will also allow us to define the certificates, which would give us the ability to do single sign-on once you log on to the website, provide the certificate for the SSL communication between the web access server and the end user's client machine. In order to do that, I already have a certificate kept on the desktop of this client machine. And as soon as deployment is over, we will define that same certificate for used in all these 3 different purposes. You can use wildcard certificates and use them in the similar fashion as well. So give me just 1 more minute. And you can see, as soon as this deployment is complete, it does give me a prompt to define a certificate. Now, I'm not going to define the certificate from here, but rather go to the task pane on my deployment overview and check out the deployment configuration. Let's bring this up in center. The first page defines whether I want to have my end users get the remote desktop connections from the web access server, which have the gateway server configuration built in. Now, in this case, I've actually defined that gateway server configuration, and I can alter that change after the fact. If I want to select licensing, I can define whether I want the session collection that I have to have per device or per user licensing to go forward. If I look at RD Web Access, it gives me the URL, what the end users will actually use to connect to the web portal to access these services. This could, of course, be published on externally. And finally, the page where I really need to do something is the certificate page where I need to define the certificates. So I can either create a new certificate right here, which would be a self-signed certificate, or I can select an existing certificate that has gone through a certification authority and is trusted by the client machines that are using. So in this case, I'm going to select an existing certificate and browse to the certificate path, which is already here. Provide the certificate, password. Hit OK, and then hit apply. The key thing to remember here is when you define a certificate for a particular server role, you need to hit apply to apply that certificate properties on that server at one shot. You cannot define certificate for all the 4 roles here and then apply them at one shot. You have to do it one at a time. So I'll hit apply. It should take just a couple of seconds, and we'll go ahead and deploy the certificate on that server role as well. I now have the connection broker publishing, which is not yet configured, and I'm going to do the same thing for the web access and the gateway server. And finally, my gateway server. So just to recap, what we've done today is deployed different server roles on different servers. We've then defined the certificates. And now the next step would be to define the session collection, which would be used to deploy multiple resources. So at this stage, I'll go ahead and click OK and go to the server page, which defines what servers have been added. And finally, to the collections page, which tells me how to create a session collection. In order to create a new session collection, I have a very simple wizard which walks me through that entire process, and it again makes it extremely easy to do it in a jiffy. My first page asks me for what the name I want to deploy. So in my case, I'm going to define this as RDS farm. And in description, I'm going to write that it would be used for a session-based desktop with 2 servers. That's what I want to deploy. Click on Next. I have a collection of the 4 session host servers that I deployed earlier. So let me pick up the first 2 and say I want to use those. Again, then get the option of selecting which security groups in AD should be allowed to have access to these. Now, since my main office was evacuated, I want to open this up for all the domain users. So I'll go ahead and leave this as domain users. And finally, we have an option of defining what sort of user profile disks you would want to have for this session collection. Now, Mark mentions a little bit about what user profile disks are. Essentially, they are VHD files which are stored on an SMB share and capture all of the user's settings and data. So I'm going to define a share which is already created. And I have defined the maximum size for per user VHD file, which is 20 gigabytes right now. I click on Next, and it gives me a confirmation. Now, just for kicks, I'm actually going to open up that share, and I'm going to show you that we actually do have a file here, which is a VHD template for the same user profile disk. As soon as I click Create, it's going to first configure the services for Session Desktop on the RDS session host servers and delete the user profile disk template on this share and recreate it on the basis of what those session host servers are. So if you have stale data on the share, which has the name of VHD template, it would get overwritten. So if I do a refresh now, you can see that file has been recreated with a current timestamp. So this is a property page for my farm collection. Some of us have used group policies to configure different settings, like what redirection is allowed for the end user connection. We pretty much do the same thing now from this wizard, which allows us to define what user groups have access to it, the session disconnect and idle disconnect times, the security for the clients, which they should be negotiating, and the load balancing that I want to bring in this environment. If this environment consisted of tens or hundreds of servers, we could easily come in and define what sort of load balancing we want in that environment. At this point of time, since I have 2 virtual machines and they're both working fine, I'm not going to change anything in terms of the memory and the relative weight. But if you had a situation where one of the session host servers was a little bit low spec than the others, you could define the relative weight in the farm configuration at this stage. We then have the option of defining what sort of redirection policies or printer redirection we want to allow. And I'm just going to zoom this so it becomes a little bit more visible. So in this case, I've allowed pretty much all of them. The one key thing you will notice is the maximum number of redirected monitors. We used to have a default number of 4 redirected monitors in Server 2008 R2. Starting with Server 2012, you can have up to 16 monitors for the end user's remote desktop session. Now, that being said, my experience doing health checks on remote desktop services tells me it's not always a good idea to leave this as 16. When you leave this as 16 and end user connects using 4 ultra high resolution monitors, it's going to put excessive load on the session host server to cater for that same load. So while this is a good thing, you should always pay attention to what's the use case scenario for the users. And if that number is anything less than 16, we would want you to put that number in. So in this case, I'm going to leave this as 16, but it's just one important thing to configure. Finally, we are coming back to the configuration of the user profile disk. So the path for the user profile disk is listed And number 2, I get the option of selecting whether I want to capture all the user settings and the data in that user profile disk or only a specific set of settings. So let me scroll further down. And you can see if I select this radio button, I get the option of selecting what data will make its way into that user profile disk versus what data would simply be discarded at the user log off. So I'll let this environment stay as it is. Apply. And hit OK. We've created a session-based desktop collection for the users, but we also want to deploy a remote app scenario where users can just simply have access to the one app that they need access to get their job done. So let's go ahead back to the collections page, and this time we're going to create a new collections for specific remote apps. So my collection name is RDS Remote Apps. I'm going to add both my servers in this pool. I'll let the domain users have access to it. I'm not going to worry about user profile disk because the application is simply a form-based front end. All it's really doing is in backend database, so if the user loses the settings, that's totally fine. I get a confirmation page, and I hit the create. As soon as this wizard is over, we will go back and actually pick and choose the specific applications we want the end user to have access to. So let's go ahead. Instead of using the session-based desktop here, we're going to go ahead and select Publish Remote Programs. Yep, visible. What it's doing now is going and collating all the programs available on one of the session host servers to expose and pick and choose for our deployment. Now, in my case, what I really want to do is I want to deploy Calculator because they are using a patch management system. I'm going to deploy, let's say, Media Player, WordPad, and since I know some of them are geeks, I'm going to deploy PowerShell ISE as well. Now, one app that I missed and I did not find in here was the actual proprietary application, which didn't install in a proprietary form. So I'm just going to go ahead and click on Add and actually browse to the exe file that's required for that remote app. So in this case, I have this been and gone application, so I'm going to go ahead and click on Open. And now I have selected all the applications that I really care about. One thing which we must focus here is this. Because I have collected this information from one of the session host servers in that session collection, it's my responsibility to ensure that all the apps that I'm deploying or selecting here are actually installed on each of those session host servers. Now, in my case, I've actually done that already. But if I forget doing that, my user's experience would differ between one session and the other. So it's very important to make sure that the applications are deployed consistently on each of the session host servers. So here is a list of all the applications. I go ahead and click on Publish. And it's done. Anybody wants to try and see what this web access page would look like? We're going to open up the Azure deployment that we have later on, and we're going to give you some user accounts that we've pre-created for you to actually see that on one of the kiosk machines in the office. So at this page, I can then go ahead and pretty much call it a day and say my deployment is ready. I want to let my end users actually start using this. In order to do that, I'm going to open up my browser. But before that, let me do this quick test. And I want to show you clearly that my logged on user, because I'm deploying something across multiple servers, is indeed the administrator. But I want to experience the magic of single sign-on for a user perspective. So what I'm going to do is log on my web browser. I have the shortcut for the right here. and it's going to get me to a login page. What's interesting to note here is, even though my logged on credentials are for the administrator, when I provide the credentials here, I'm going to use a user account that would actually have access to that application. So clearly, Fourth Coffee RDS user and the password, and I've marked this as a private computer. And you can see, right now, I have my farm connection, my Bean and Gone application, my PowerShell ISE, WordPad, all of them available for the end users. And it has literally taken us less than 40 minutes to get here. So we know we had 2 separate session collections. So at this stage, what I'm going to do is I'm going to launch my application on one, and at the same time, launch a connection to the RDS farm to get a session-based deployment. I'll let these two complete in just a minute.
I didn't see any logon prompts there, Monish.
And here's my application logged on as the user without any credential prompts. Just to make sure that we all believe that that's exactly what has happened, on my session-based desktop, I'm going to open up PowerShell, type hostname, and you can see the hostname is indeed the session host 2, and you can see clearly the user account that's created is RDS user 1, the account that we used on the web sign-in page. If I go back to my server manager, it presents a very easy way for me to identify what user has actually logged on to these sessions. So if I just go here and hit a refresh, you can see that I have RDS user 1 logged on to session host 4 for the first session collection. Similarly, because my second user, the same user account was logged on to the second collection for the farm, you can see it right here. The logged on credentials are exactly the same as the web page without any prompts for credentials. All right, so
So we've shown you session virtualization. Manish, you want to go through what you've exactly deployed?
So just to quickly recap, what we've deployed today is 4 session host servers fronted by a connection broker to do the load balancing, an RD gateway and a web access server to provide access over the internet, and finally, a bunch of clients which can access that environment. Now, when we talk about an environment of this type, a very quick question I get all the time is around high availability. Now, high availability is extremely important for an RDS deployment. Now, in Server 2008 R2, this is how things worked. The RD web app and the gateway servers were both used as a web farm to bring about high availability. The session host servers had a feature for making them part of a farm since Server 2003, so that's nothing new. Remote desktop licensing was always available as a split across multiple license servers with the discovery scope, or available as a clustering role. And if you were deploying a VDI-based deployment, you have VDI sitting on a Hyper-V which can participate in clustering to actually give you the scalability and high availability at the same time. Now, in this picture, one thing which did not have the scalability requirement to meet the growing demand was, in fact, the remote desktop connection broker. In Server 2008 and 2008 R2, the best you could get was an active passive cluster for a connection broker. Starting with Server 2008, Server 2012, We now have option of using a SQL database instead of a Windows internal database for storing this connection broker information. And as a result, you can now have an active cluster for connection brokering and get a high availability and scalability story across the board and not have a single point of failure.
Cool. So we've spoken a little bit about what a rich user experience is. Certainly in 2012 R2, we've made some massive enhancements in regards to rich user experiences. We've got adaptive graphics based on content and based on device. So whether you're on a tablet system, or on a PC, or on a laptop with touch as well, we'll give you the best user experience we possibly can. As a result of that, we've made it easy to move across devices. We've got full multi-touch support for up to 10 points of touch. We've got single sign-on, as you've just seen. And we also integrate seamlessly with the local desktop. So in 2012 R2, it's almost completely impossible to tell the difference between an application installed on your local PC and one that's running in the cloud, in your data center, on a server sitting somewhere. We do desktop composition. We also do peek to view from the taskbar, so you can actually see what's going on in that app, similar to your Windows 7 apps. So in 2012 R2, we've also given you the ability to dynamically add and remove monitors, improved remote app behavior, and that faster reconnect. In addition to that, we've got full DirectX 11.1 support. So you can stream media and you can view web pages with text, videos, music, whatever. That content comes down faster and more efficiently. So, just going to have a quick look and see how my RDS deployment with PowerShell's gone.
While you're checking on that, I'm going to showcase one last thing before I discard my demo. Now, if you wanted to make sure the users do not have to go through that entire process of actually logging on to a website and then getting access to all their resources, there is a brand new feature available in Server 2008 R2 and Server 2012, and that's the remote app and desktop connections. Has anybody seen this icon before? So it's there in your control panel, and all it really needs is if you click and provide a URL for the website where you provided your login. So in my case, this was the URL I used for actual login. If I simply add feed/webfeed.aspx in front of it, this makes it into a remote desktop and remote app connection URL. So I'm going to go ahead and simply paste this. Click on next. It's going to tell me that I'm ready to set up a connection. Ask me for credentials, and I can provide any credentials that have access to that remote app. I could be logged on with any non-domain user on this local machine and provide my work credentials to get access. So this is really good for scenarios where users are bringing in their own device and trying to connect to the app resources back in Office. So in this case, I'm just going to go ahead and type hit OK, and immediately it picks up and tells me that I have now access to a bunch of work resources which are coming from that particular URL, which allows me to have access to 4 programs, which are essentially remote apps, and a desktop. If I click Finish and hit the Start button, you can clearly see on the right side, we have a Work Resources RDS section, and it includes my remote app for all the 4 apps that I've deployed, along with my desktop. Now, if giving this URL to your end user is a problem, there is still a very, very straightforward group policy to do the same thing. So if it was actually a device that you actually own and it's part and managed, you can deploy the same URL through the remote desktop connection in user profile settings and then specify the URL right there. Cool. I think I'm done.
Cool. So taking a quick look at my, my PowerShell script, it looks like it's all completed successfully. So if we take a look at what we've done as part of this, we can see that we've installed the desktop experience, We've installed quality Windows and audio and video experience, and we've installed this NPS role, which is the RDS gateway. So we've brought up a fresh IIS VM, we've installed the remote desktop services roles, and we've configured it as an RD gateway. So if we go to our web browser, and let me just do this in something a little more. So remember that your end users might be on different devices, using different browsers, using different form factors. So let's quickly just see. If I go to my Azure endpoint, we can see we get access to work resources straight from a PowerShell script. Now I'm a Fourth Coffee user, so I'll quickly log on here. See if I can get my password right. And there we go. We've got an internet-based virtual machine that's been spun up, with some of our critical applications that users can use in any browser, from any environment, and they can do it securely. So we'll click Been and Gone, and obviously we don't get that nice user experience with Chrome, but that's okay. We'll click that one there, and we'll authenticate. See if I get my password right. Now apparently not. If we flick back, and we'll just go through what we've done. So let's quickly scroll through the code. So we've joined the domain automatically. We've configured the DNS server, and we've configured the Windows firewall. You'll see here we have one line, and let me just make sure I point this one out. Those 6 clicks that Manish did, that's what this does. So if you didn't know, Server Manager has been repurposed to run completely on PowerShell. That Server Manager had in 2008 R2, it's long gone. This one sits on top of PowerShell, calls all the right APIs, so anything you can do in Server Manager, you can do here as well.
So it looks like you were essentially the wizard I was talking about.
Yeah, what can I say? So let's just go through. We've configured the RD gateway as well. So that's obviously a secondary step, and we need a reboot for that. So we call a reboot and just get it to check in. Finally, we use the new RD remote app commandlets to create some remote apps on our published web page, add them to our session collection, and then publish them to the web. If you've got internal PKI, we also set the RD certificate, or you can create a self-signed certificate like we've done here. Finally, if you've ever deployed remote desktop services before, you'll be aware of caps. We do those as part of the command line, whereas the wizard does it all by itself. So maybe I'm not such a wizard. Cool. So let's just have a quick look. Accept the certificate. And that should log in for me any second. Cool. So I'm going to make this PowerShell script available. I'll clean up my name out of it so you don't have to take that home. But certainly, if you want to have a look at it, if you want to have a play with it and get some tips and tricks, it might help you to deploy some IaaS stuff. It might also help you deploy RDS in the future if you find yourself in a been and gone type scenario. Cool. Now, one thing I'll note now that this is loaded up is this is an RD application, and you can see I don't get that outline as I move it around. This is running in a Singapore data center probably somewhere.
Still, the experience is pretty good.
Cool.
All right. So some of the web links from today's session are up here, but feel free to reach out and meet us. We would be there in the Premier support stand in the showcase floor, and we'll love to take some Q&A. If you have some questions up on the Twitter feed, we'll check that and we'll try to answer that. But please stick around. We will close the session and then open it up for any Q&A.
And please fill out our surveys. You can win a Sculpt mouse if you do, so we really, really appreciate the feedback. We want to hear what you have to say about these sessions and see if you like it and see if you like learning about some of this new stuff that's coming in 2012 and 2012 R2.
Thank you. With that, we want to thank you for your time and giving us the opportunity to showcase something that we could get it done in quick. And I'm going to open up for any Q&A. I think there's no mic, but I'll take it up. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Any questions?
Yeah, are there any plans to bring out the RDS gateway support for the Mac client?
RD gateway support for the Mac client. I quite honestly am not sure, but I can check it up and look it back to you. I quite honestly don't know. Cool, thank you. Yep.
We've just gone through a couple of deployments, and the big issue's always been getting, so it's on-premise deployment. We want to get the external users in. Using TMG Forefront as the gateway,
Okay,
and that's been really tricky to configure even with the wildcard certificates,
okay.
because the certificate, we ended up being able to get a certificate that has the internal path and the external path on it.
So alternate server, subject name.
Yeah.
Yep.
But we've only got one IP address. And so we've got other things that need the wildcard certificate. And so we ended up, there was a lot of hurdles, whereas from documentation, we assumed that as long as we get to the web gateway,
Yep.
single sign-on would work.
So there are two things. There is a certificate for single sign-on based on the connection broker,
Yeah.
right? So when we deployed the certificate, there was a certificate for the web access server. In addition to that, there were two certificates for the connection broker. So come reach out to me afterwards and I'll show that to you. But there is a separate certificate in those two, which is exclusively for a single sign-on. So you could create a certificate exclusively for single sign-on and then get it done that way.
Okay.
Yep.
And is that still is that used forms authentication?
Forms, yes. But I can double check if there is any alternate way of doing it as well. Yeah, sure. Thank you.
Can it run 2003 apps in remote app?
Remote app. So remote apps doesn't classify apps in terms of app compatibility. If you have an app that works on 2008 or 2012, it would be available as a remote app to the end user regardless of what platform they use. So you could have an app running out of Server 2012. If it works through some way, creating a shim or whatever that way that might be, if it works on the session host server, the end user could be using anything and they would still have access to that app.
And yet, what if you've got an app that only runs on Windows 2003?
So remote app is never pitched as an app compat solution. It does absolutely nothing to make an app which did not run on Server 2012 and magically make it work on Server 2012. You still essentially deal with an app running off a particular OS that's sitting on a session host server. So what you receive it on doesn't matter, but where it runs does matter. So I wouldn't classify that as an app compat solution. You can use things like AppV to see if you can have a better success in making that application run. But again, AppV itself is not considered as an app compat solution per se. So my experience has been using applications such as a Hummingbird and things like that, which did not work on 2012. With AppV, they worked, even though AppV wasn't designed to be an app compat solution. And once they were running on a Server 2012 as an AppV application, I could stream them as a remote app regardless. Yep, that works. Cool, thank you.
Previous TechEds, I noticed Citrix were always hosted here, or at least
Sure.
having an involvement.
Yep.
All the features you've demonstrated today
Yep.
is pretty much what Citrix has offered. So
I'm
have
sure.
you seen a divergence in relationship with Citrix because
So-
you've replicated what they've done?
So I'm not from the product team. I'm a field engineering team, so I can't say authoritatively, but I'll say what I've seen in field. It's a question of looking at what sort of feature set you care about versus what's the cost of implementation. If what you can get here, and coming with Azure, it makes it really, really cheap. If the set of features that you get in the current version of the deployment meets your demand, maybe you don't need to go that far. But we've seen a valid case scenario where the feature set provided by us, maybe the endpoint client support on iPads and things like that, where Citrix have a listener, definitely makes a case to have them in consideration. But again, at the end of the day, in terms of field, you always look at what's the return of investment and the feature set that I get out of it. So I'm hoping to start seeing some divergence. I haven't seen as much of it so far. That's my experience.
And final question,
Can I take his question
Yeah,
first?
sure,
Yep,
sir.
sorry.
User profile disc, does that make application mode for use with Office 365 not a viable solution within a desktop session?
So user profile disk is sort of ignorant of what applications you're running behind the scenes and are caching that information in here. So it doesn't really care whether it's Office 365 or any other application. If it's part of what you would consider as app data inside the user's profile, it would get captured in that disk. So it's not really going to classify application A versus application B. We have a slightly different solution for that, which stands for User Experience Virtualization, if you've heard of it. So UEV is catered to capture settings in that aspect and capture it on a backend server, and that settings can roam. The user profile disk have a very limited scope of use, which is in a particular session collection. You can't have a user profile disk from session collection number 1 reused in session collection number 2. So they are created per session collection.
Yeah. I just
Cool.
know that previously there's been a big limitation when using Cage Mode Outlook because
Yep.
the roaming profile would have to move that back and forth. So I wonder.
It's used mostly in case of VDI-based deployments, and there is a white paper that's just about to be released, which is VDI optimization on Windows Server 2012 stack. So it's sort of performance and tuning guidelines, and that would cover a lot of these Q&A. I've read through a draft of that document, but I'm sure it's going to be out real soon. Cool. I have one question back from him, and then I'll come to you. So, yep.
I wasn't too clear when you were deploying. You had the web services and the gateway.
Yep.
Was it purely just on the method of access for the user, like through the web browser for the web services server versus?
Very good. So if I have, and I can relate to him because I've worked with him on a deployment which was very similar. Let's say you're deploying remote desktop services for your intranet, right? You're not talking about any users coming from outside. If it is exclusively from your intranet, you're not going to do any RDP over HTTPS translation. You're going to do everything remotely, right, inside the intranet. In that case, you don't need the gateway server. You just have an RD web gateway, and RD web access server simply delivers you an RDP file. When you do have a gateway server, because you want to cater for external user, the gateway IP address and the gateway name gets embedded in that RDP file that the web access server hands out to the end user. So there is an option there, say automatically detect gateway settings and bypass gateway server for local. So when you do those two checkboxes and you get the RDP file, you would try to locate whether you can get access to the connection broker directly. If you can't get there directly, you're going to then leverage the gateway server and pass your RDP credentials over HTTPS to the gateway server. The gateway server receives, authenticates, make sure you are allowed the CAP policy and the NAP policy. Once it confirms that you're good, it simply strips off the HTTPS traffic data and moves the RDP data back in your intranet. So whether or not you need a gateway server depends entirely on where you want to deploy these services to. If it's
the same servers that have to be separate hardware?
so no, you can, except for the session host, you can combine licensing, gateway, web access on a single server. And that's what the quick deployment versus standard deployment talks about. So if you do a quick deployment, it will do everything for you on a single box. Perfect. Yep.
Does the web page, is it still only limited to IE browser or is it all different browsers?
Mark showed that on Chrome.
That was on Chrome?
Sorry, I didn't call it.
Yeah, so that we wanted to showcase. We were not a big fan, but we wanted to showcase that you can have two different browsers. I did it on IE, he did it on Chrome.
You don't get some of the same IWA, like integrated Windows Auth and stuff like that in other browsers. It's not quite the same user experience, but it does work. It does work. Yeah.
Yep. So the way Chrome handles an RDP file, it thinks of it as a download file. It doesn't launch. Like if you are in an IE, it has an ActiveX control for RDP. So when you click on that link, it opens up because it understands it's an RDP file to be used by a specific ActiveX control. Whereas in any other browser, you may not have that ActiveX control, but you'll still get the RDP file, which would be natively understood by the OS, and OS would launch that for you anyways. So my experience has been if I've not used IE as a browser, my cache for RDP files on the local machine, because it puts a garbage number there, it just becomes massive eventually. But they are RDP files, nevertheless. They're not really massive.
Okay. All right, cool.
Cool. Thank you. Any question? No. Yeah. I'll sit down.